Hello, Simon, and welcome to JCommerce. Perhaps you'd like to begin with just telling us what you actually do.
Thank you for having me, Ossie, first of all. In a nutshell, we're a managed service provider. So we provide a range of IT services, products and IT services, which enhance, secure, backup, and monitor and manage a client's IT infrastructure or estate, should we say. That's what we do in a nutshell. We provide proactive monitoring for users' devices. We provide backups for whether files, servers, or emails, and we also obviously we do security products around those services. So securing the endpoints of devices. We secure email traffic, secure the networks. And then we do a bit of hardware and software sales as well together with it.
So do you concentrate mainly on the security aspect of sort of making sure things are safe, or is it all IT related stuff?
Well, security plays a big role in it. So there's the idea is that whatever you've got, we try to secure. So yes, the security is a big part of what we do, but it's not the be all and end all of it. Obviously, there's the break fix problems which we're repairing, slow machines, broken things as well. That's part of it. But our main focus, and that's probably our USP in the Jewish community in Manchester, is that we try to make sure that what you have is secure as much as possible, and it will also work. It's tailored to, obviously, per business. It's not a set of blanket rules for everybody, but yeah, that's what it is in a nutshell.
Right. And when did you start this? When did you get into this?
I've always been into IT, so I started it 14, 15 years ago, something like that. Something I always wanted to do, and it was an opportunity. Well, the business started really because we always wanted to do it, but I was trying to find a job in IT, but there was no one either in the community or outside the community at the time who were willing to either take me on or it didn't work out, and that's try and get. So would turn around and thought to myself, well, if I can do what other people are doing as well as, and I can charge for it, why should I not do it? So I only had 2 kids at the time. Yankee was only a baby at the time. So if we don't do it now, well, my expenses are low. The thought of doing it now, no way, no way. Not my stage in life, but for other people, if you want to start something like this, there aren't great barriers to entry in terms of cost. There's no major investment needed or anything like that. It's always good to start when you're young because it takes time to find good customers. They don't come. They're not coming every Monday and Thursday. So we started when I was young, and it started as a break fix business, which a lot do. But as the IT landscape and the threat landscapes evolved over the years, that's what we try to focus on, the security aspect of it. So a lot of people say, yeah, well, I can get it cheaper. So we'll go and get it cheaper then, but they're not going to give the level of proactive monitoring that we're doing. I'm not going to give the level of security, and they're not going to give the level of the backups necessarily, and the response to those issues as quick as we do.
So you mentioned that it can be difficult for one to build a customer base. So how important is networking to you, and what do you get involved with in terms of networking?
Well, it's been we used to do things. There's something called Simply Networking, which is you pay on the door, so it's networking outside the Jewish community. That was quite effective. I got a couple of customers from that. But I mean, it's one of those, the more effort you put into that sort of thing, the more you're going to get out of it. But you've got to have the time to put the effort in after the meetings. There's no point going to meetings and then you disappear in a black hole for a week and then you come back again, because nothing's ever you're not going to get anything out of it. That's one thing I've learned. We've done things like BNI, we've done things, we've tried things like that, but there's a lot of time around it, which I haven't really had the time for. So sort of not really revisited. A lot of it stopped during COVID. We were doing quite a bit of it beforehand, but then COVID came along and that all went. So we just we're not really gone back to it, to be honest. But networking is important because you do need to show yourself you're out there. I mean, last year we did JTrade. You probably remember we did JTrade last year. It was a success. I got a customer out of it. Out of a few hundred leads, I got a good customer out of it. So from that point of view, definitely worthwhile. However, it's a big investment this year, and with whatever else, with things going on, it didn't pay to do it this year. But definitely worthwhile. And you're definitely going to go out. You've got to get out there to put your name out.
And how do you see physical networking in terms of actually meeting people versus advertising or marketing yourself on either social media or paid advertising, website related work, etc.? Do you see there's point to both, or is it one or the other?
Well, our sort of industry, IT is, as someone put it in the trade, IT is oxygen to any business. Whether it's the connectivity side of things, or it's the actual, physical, the actual infrastructure or the services you have. Without them, if you haven't got access to your emails, you haven't got access to your files, and you think you can't function. It's just not, most people's business would grind to a halt by the end of the day if they didn't have access to it, within reason. So it's the networking. I'd say it's extremely important. But the point to remember in our sort of industry, unless you're doing a break fix repair or you're doing a hard, sales, what's most important is word of mouth, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, to get that word of mouth is a lot of work. And I remember back in the day, it was hard to get the ball rolling. You're starting up in certain people's, selling quicker for people. You've got to have the first few projects to springboard to start the business off. But at the end of the day, our business comes from word of mouth. We can advertise all day and night. It's not going to make a difference, because unless someone says you're good at what you do, it's not going to make a difference. Just because an accountant advertises in the paper, you're not going to go and change your accountant. End of the day, accountants know more about the financial situation of the husband's business or whatever it is, the financial affairs, more so than the wife does. And it's the same thing, the IT, the IT, the power that the IT companies have for the companies, for their clients is huge, and the responsibility is massive that goes with it. It's not a joke. It's not something, you can come back to when you fancy. It's literally people's businesses you're running for them. And that's really, from my experience in 15 years of doing this, is word of mouth is number one. Now, you've got to wrap around that. You've got to put your adverts out. You've got people who've got to say, oh yeah, I've seen your name somewhere else. That's one of the big reasons why we did JTrade, because it was massive exposure. Yes, when we got it down to a list of 6 decent interviews, meetings, and I got one good client out of it. But at the end of the day, the thousands of companies have seen the name out and about. Yes, maybe I should have done it again this year. That's another debate. But at the end of the day, it's down to word of mouth. So networking is important, but at the end of the day, the best networking is the work you've actually done. That's your best advertising you can do. So it's always best to leave a good impression and not to try to stitch anybody up. Be open and honest with what you're doing. If you can't do something, say in advance you can't do it. We know we're currently doing a project at the moment, which is a big massive migration to Azure. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's Microsoft's big online platform for putting servers in and things like that in simple English. Some of that stuff is out of our remit, so we're pulling in extra third-party help to do it, and the client's fully aware from day one that that's the situation. We're not trying to white label it and pretend it's all ourselves, and because at the end of the day, once the client sees through that, the trust has dropped out the bottom of it. So if you're open and honest with them, they will give you they'll give you the space usually if they're the right client.
Right. And more broadly, zoning out of your particular business and the space that you take up, what would your advice be? What would your perspective be that you could share to someone who wanted to set off on a new business, someone wanted to get a business off the ground? What would your sort of first principles be to such a person? What would you say to them that he needs to focus on?
So the first thing you'd say is you've got to find what your USP is, what your unique selling point is. There's no point saying we do what everybody else does. We could do the same as everybody else, because there's loads of people, especially in our industry, there's loads of people doing it. You've got to find something unique about what you're doing. You've got to do something slightly differently. That's really what it is in a nutshell. In any business, really, if you're doing the same as anybody else, why would someone take you on? Yes, you can say you're cheaper on price, but anybody who's been in business for a while knows cheap is not always best. So if you're good at something, if you're good at what you do, you've got to get testimonials, you've got to get some sort of referrals. That's really, you build up your referral list. That's very important, of current customers you're happy with. But yeah, to start off with, you've got to get referrals from other things, other sectors you've been working. Let's say you want to change industry, whatever it is. Skills are transferable. So what have you done in the previous one, which will set you well in another industry? I speak to a lot of people a lot of the time that they've done marketing, and then they're insolvency practitioners. One's got nothing to do with the other, but at the end of the day, it's to do with, you know, transferable skills. So you've got to find what your unique selling point is, and you've got to have good good recommendations, I think, for what, if you want to start something off.
And what are the signs for a person to see to recognize when they're wasting their time with something? Like they've tried, that they're sort of getting it off the ground, but it's getting a bit shaky. Well, what should be the red flag to someone to say, listen, you're wasting your time with this?
It's a hard question. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience and from my own, you know, trying to get new business. You know, I started this business off when, you know, a long time ago. I suppose the world was a completely different place then, but I would say from my own experience, you know, trying to get new customers on board, that's one way I can see it, is that I've learned to smell a rat pretty quickly when someone's messing you around in time, you know, in terms of time, and they're leading you down the garden path. And, you know, you try, you know, you've got to try to some extent, but then you've got to realize that either they want some, you know, I've always had this rightly or wrongly, I suppose I get it from my father, but if someone's messing you around, you've got to go straight to them. Are you interested or are you not? In a nice way, do it in a polite way, but ultimately, you know, you've got to know where you stand. You know, whether a particular product I suppose the answer is you've got to find someone you can trust, really. If you can find someone you can trust who's been out there and done the similar thing somewhere else in a different area, you know, say to them, what do you think of this idea? You know, try and speak to somebody. You know, I've got another managed service provider I picked up at a trade show, which are based in, was it Southampton way or somewhere? I spoke to them once. Our truth is I should speak to them again. You know, it's always good to bounce ideas off them. Then they're not worried that, you know, I'm much smaller than they are. They're not worried that I'm going to take their business off them. But it's always good to bounce ideas off each other. So you've got to find someone in that industry who's done it a long time, who's not going to be worried that you're trying to take their business off them. And you've got to ask them what their advice is. Someone who's been around a long time, someone who doesn't need the business either. You know, someone who's young and hungry for business, desperate for business. If you give them the idea, what do you think of this thing? No, don't say it's rubbish, and they go and do it behind your back. You know, that is something you've got to be careful as well. Someone out the area, someone you've got no connection with. You know, LinkedIn will be great for something like that. You know, to try and find people in the similar industry, and see what their idea is, or try and find. Or put something out on LinkedIn. What would you think if someone would set up X, Y, and Z? Maybe that's the way. You know, obviously people would see that, but you could be a bit more vague, maybe, or hide behind somebody else, possibly in a different. You get someone else to put the question out for you. What do you think of this? And if you get a good response, then, you know, it's worth a shot, I guess.
So that's a good segue into the question of mentoring and advice, external advice. I mean, would you recommend a person takes up some sort of business mentor? Have you yourself gained from professional advice? Obviously, you were saying the advantage of talking to other people within the industry, that's great, but I'm saying even more than that, kind of targeted business advice.
Well, I was just started with something. There's something very good, which I don't know if you know. I'm sure you know, of something called the Business Growth Hub in Manchester. It's definitely worth looking into. It's free advice for businesses in the Greater Manchester area, I think. And I've just started off with a business coach, which I took on a few months ago. They're pretty. What's the word? It's free, so it's not going to be like on. You know, they're not going to be on tap 24/7. But when I've asked them a question, I've got an answer, and they usually have people who've had businesses in the past, or they've been in business a long time to be able to give advice. And he was saying, you know, for example, if you're losing money, you know, after the second month, if you're still, he gave examples from his father, and he said his father was in business in some sort of engineering, I think it was. He said if he wasn't making money after. He was losing money on the second month running, he'd sack a load of workers, you know, rightly or wrongly. And that maybe, but the idea is if you've got to be, you know, he was giving advice based off, you know, experience. So it's definitely worth. You've got to have a mentor. I mean, I can list names, but it's not fair. People in the past have given me advice, and they've always stood me in good stead. Some aren't around anymore. I'm showing my age, but you know, some people aren't around anymore. But you've got to find someone you can trust, someone who knows your family as well, who knows you. That's very important to have someone you can. You know, doesn't necessarily have to be an official business coach as such, but you know, someone who's been in business, you know, is on the other side of it. He's on, you know, he's in his autumn years in terms of working, so they're not desperate for business. He's done his bit, and that's the sort of people you really want to be speaking to, unless they don't get it. You know, there's no point me speaking to somebody, you know, about, you know, someone who's in his 70s about what do I think about a particular security product. They're not going to get it. But you know, but the general business advice, definitely find someone older, someone who's not going to be potentially a competitor on it, and ask them what they think.
What's your view on a partnership potential on something, someone sharing your business with you? What's your view on that? Is it a good thing, not a good thing, advise, not?
Well, I've seen it before in business. Obviously we've had quite a few, the life cycle of businesses. We've had some before which have fallen. I've seen, not myself, but advice I've seen. The first piece of advice is, if you don't need it, don't start it. The only reason you should have a partnership is if they're going to bring different skill sets to the table. If they're going to bring different skill sets which you don't have, so together you make a good team, and one couldn't manage without the other, then it's worthwhile doing it. However, if you're both doing the same thing, then what you generally find is you split up and go your separate ways later on, and then that gets messy. So my advice is, unless you really have to, don't even bother, because you've got no.
What if a person's in need of capital in order to sort of raise capital for his business? So he has an option of either taking money from an external investor or taking on a partner. Again, without giving away anything confidential about your own setup, what would you? How does that come to you? What's the present there?
As if that's my experience would be, is if you don't, it's a very difficult one. I can't really answer that because I'm not. It's not my. I've never needed to do it. I've known other situations where ideally it's great, it works out well in the short term, maybe medium term, long term, it could work out very well, but at some point it might very well come back to bite you. But there again, if you haven't got a choice, you haven't got a choice. If you need X amount of money to set up, but you've really got a good business idea and it's really worthwhile, then go for it. I mean, ideally, I'm not a financial advisor, but you're best off going to a bank because you're not going to fall out with them, are you?
Yeah.
Even if it costs you an interest.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, especially if you're trying to set up with someone who you know very well and in the community and all that usual story, then you're asking for trouble. That's my advice. If you don't need it, stay away from it. If you need it, either try and borrow it from a bank or borrow it from somebody else, but then try and keep them out of it. Then you're not mixing the two together, if that's possible.
That makes sense. Yeah, sure. Early on, you mentioned about building a business and the need to do sort of put in some good, honest work and be straight with your customers. So just curious in terms of looking after your clients, looking after your customers, how important is that to you? What does that look like to you in your line of business?
Looking after my customers is an ongoing thing, 24/7. You can never do enough for your customers. That's the honest truth. You've always got to look for ways to improve. You've always got to try and do better than what you're doing at the moment. You've always got to learn to accept where you've gone wrong and realize accept their criticism. But as long as you've got, very important to keep things documented. And when we run the ticketing system, so everything comes in has got to come in on the ticket, and you've got to, so everything's accountable. Even at the end of the day, you've got to try and you really got to try to keep your customers as happy as possible, because however hard it is to move IT provider, believe me, it does happen. So it's very important to try and, it's constant. It's effectively a relationship more so than you're not selling them something, you're not going to see them again. The worst thing you can have is not answering the phone to somebody or not getting back to them sharp. Expecting, not responding to somebody is the worst thing anybody can do to anybody. It gets me so wound up. When you're trying to deal with tradesmen, especially in the community, to all your community tradesmen out there, if you don't answer the phone to somebody, as far as I'm concerned, you can forget it. Because it's just not fair. You've got to really, every small job can lead. You never know where that small job will lead to. I was speaking to a supplier the other day, and they were saying to me something about, couldn't get hold of them because of this World Cup nonsense going on. I couldn't get hold of them. Finally, he answered the phone at 5:25, and he says to me, I said to him, "Well, what if I told you I've got a big job for you?" So he says to me, "Oh yeah, it'll be different." I said, "Well, I have actually," and he still doesn't come back to me. But the point is that you never know. The small stuff can often lead to the big stuff, and if you don't help someone with the small stuff, then they can forget. They're not going to get the big stuff. So one of the most important lessons that piece of advice is, however small, however petty it might seem, you never know where that might lead, because one conversation leads to another.
Absolutely. So moving into the final segment, a person going into business, understands it's going to take a huge amount of personal investment of his own time and effort, and obviously all about this. So what would be the advice to get the work-life balance right, and what's kind of been your experience with that? What have you developed for yourself?
Well, the biggest problem you've got is people working from home, because then what will happen is you get that blur between business and home stuff. When you're home, I could work from home a lot of the time. unless I'm getting deliveries in, I could work from home. Problem with working from home is that you have the issue of this needs repairing, this needs putting in the oven, this needs the wash needs sorting, whatever it is. So work-life balance, the best is if you're out the house and you can then break off at a certain time. Now, when you're starting off in business, that is very, 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 very hard to stick to, because you're trying to build a brand and you can't really be in a position of trying to tell a new customer, I'm not available for you. I spoke to another supplier once, who says, well, for new business, I'm always available. And that's true to some extent. Is for new business, you always got to be available. But it's like anything, there's a fine balance, and everyone's personal circumstances are going to be different. Ideally, you say, you try to do a 9 to 5 best as possible. Sometimes it has to be earlier, sometimes it has to be later. And another supplier once told me, my most important thing after my family is my customers. So you've got to bear that in mind as well. At the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to put put bread on your table. So and someone else once said to me, if my wife doesn't like it, I don't really care. Which there's an element of truth in there. At the end of the day, unless she's going out to work and she's earning more than you are, then you've got to put the hours in. There's no two ways about it.
Final question. What's the single piece of advice you would give to someone looking to start out either a business or in his career?
Well, I'll tell you a piece of advice I had when I started off. A client was about to sign a contract with me, and I said to him, I could maybe do a bit cheaper. He says, don't be silly. He says, let me tell you a piece of advice which someone told me many years ago and I should have listened to. He said like this, he says, make sure that you look after yourself, because if you don't look after yourself, no one else will.
That sounds a very powerful way to end. So thank you very much for joining us at JCommerce.